Okay. Welcome, everybody. This is the first session of 4 sessions, the mini-series, which is the third mini-series in a row. The first one was called Best of Both Worlds. As far as I'm concerned, really, they all can fit in that category, Best of Both Worlds. The first one was Best of Both Worlds, Heroes and Icons. The second one was Religion, Pop Culture, and the third one is Middot and pop culture. The most of what we do in this class is that we have a source sheet, supplementary reading, and then and I usually start with showing pictures of stuff relating to what we're going to be talking about. This particular session, namely instant gratification and impatience, this is a little bit different from what we do in these sessions, in that even though we will be talking a little about pop culture, we'll also be talking about culture in general, as in Western culture, the big picture, and possibly even like a little bit too ambitious, but it's a good topic, and it's one that I started researching way back when I was in my a year or two in yeshiva in Israel. I want to recommend the article that I uploaded to the website. Anything important can be said in 10 minutes by Rabbi Gidon Rothstein. Some of you may be familiar with him. He teaches Daf Yomi right here at Web Yeshiva. This article appeared in Torah Currents, which was a website that had some good articles from 2005 to 2006, and then it went bust. Fortunately, I kept some of the articles. So before we, before we start going through the source sheet, I'd like to share some pictures relating to what we're going to be talking about, and that is over here, more or less in order on the source sheet. A little bit different from what we sometimes do. There's actually more pictures than usual here because so many of the quotes we're going to be looking at are not from individual books, but like articles. So I thought I would show pictures of the people who are mostly the people who will be whose ideas we'll be looking at. So we're going to only very briefly give a couple of examples from Calvin and Hobbes. This is a picture. This is not from my own material. I found this on the internet. This is a complete set, all of the Calvin and Hobbes books, and in fact, there's a lot of overlap here. It's a legendary cartoon that only ran for 10 years, 85 to 95, but in the 25 years since, it has proved to be timeless. And I have 3. The first page of my source sheet has 3 examples from Calvin Hobbes. Hopefully we'll get to at least a couple of them. We'll be briefly discussing a scene from Raiders of the Lost Ark. Perhaps you heard of it. It's from the creators of Jaws and Star Wars movie in 1981. Oh, and that was Harrison Ford. You probably noticed that. 1984 was a movie starring a young Tom Hanks and Daryl Hannah, Splash, about a mermaid, not exactly the Little Mermaid, but you'll see how that's going to tie into a fantasy of instant gratification. We'll look briefly at an example or two from High School Musical and High School Musical 2, Disney Channel movies. And I'm not going to spend any time at all talking about Twilight. Let's just move on. I'm not interested in vampires. That's my personal bias. When we talk about, we'll go through some Torah sources, Rabbi Emmanuel Feldman. I'm just going to mention the names now, and then I'll say something about each one as we go through them. This is Rabbi Yitzchak Shuren, famous book about Rabbi Aryeh Levine. The book is called A Tzaddik in Our Time. This is just a passing reference. Rabbi Shlomo Aviner, W.H. Auden, the poet, not Jewish as far as I know. Rabbi Mark Smilowitz, a classmate of mine. Rabbanit Rivka Shimon, a contemporary Israeli teacher, Rabbi Yossi Levine, Rabbi Avi Weiss, James Gleick, the writer of popular science books, and we'll do a quote from his book, Faster, The Acceleration of Just About Everything. Then there's he's going to quote Professor Stephen Kern. I figure might as well get everybody's picture in here. We're most of the way done. Walter Benjamin, major, in retrospect, major Jewish philosopher from the early 1900s. And this, we'll see a quote from his book, Illuminations. Paul Valery, not Jewish, but a philosopher quoted by Walter Benjamin. We'll see a quote of his. Bill Bryson, contemporary author, has written lots of books. We got a great quote from him that appears in this book of his, I'm a Stranger Here Myself. Notes on returning to America after 20 years away. Daniel Bell, we'll see a quote from his book, very important sociologist from the early, from the mid-20th century. And we'll see a quote from his book, The Cultural Contradictions of Capitalism. And we'll briefly talk about the rise of credit cards. We'll see a bunch of things from an article by this guy, Christopher Muther, writes for the Boston Globe. We'll talk briefly about two-day shipping from Walmart and Amazon Prime. And if we have time, I want to talk briefly about the phenomenon of skipping lines, paying more to skip lines at Disney World. I guess it's kind of ambitious, but there's also Netflix, the contrast between their original service, in which they send you a DVD in the mail and you watch it and you send it back. Believe it or not, that's the way that Netflix became big before the current version, which is all online on-demand streaming. Lee Siegel is a journalist. He has an article on the last page or two. Tommy Tomlinson, a journalist who wrote this book, a poignant memoir. I see Barry's holding up a Netflix envelope. There you go. There are still people out there who have the DVD service. Thank you, Barry. So Tommy Tomlinson wrote this book, The Elephant in the Room, one fat man's quest to get smaller in a growing America. I want to see a quote from him. By the way, we're still going to try to wrap this all up in an hour. I'm not sure how. I guess we'll skip. Stephen Covey, famous self-improvement author. And we'll see a quote not from The 7 Habits of Highly Effective People, but from one of his other books, First Things First. His journalist, Winton Weeks. Micah Goodman, very important contemporary Israeli religious author. And finally, Rabbi Dal Marmer, retired rabbi from Toronto. That's our plan for this session. And just to get it out of the way, let's start with one second. Well, I only have one brief video clip. It's a really famous one, but it'll get us into the topic of fictional fantasies, namely the fantasy of, wouldn't it be great if you could do everything instantly? So I'm sure everybody's already seen this, but it's really just less than a minute. Famous scene from Raiders of the Lost Ark. That's it. That's the whole scene. One second. Just close that. Okay. That's the whole thing. It is a famous scene. So why do we just look at that scene? Because a website that we've seen before in these series, and I highly recommend, TV Tropes. They have a website. They have a page called Cutting the Knot. What's the theme of Cutting the Knot? Based on the legend of Alexander the Great, that within his legend there was a previous legend that whoever can untie this knot will be the king of Asia. So according to the standard version, there's multiple versions, Alexander the Great decided he wanted to conquer Asia and he couldn't untie the knot, so he just cut it. Wow, that's such a great solution. Wouldn't it be great? There you go. And then he went on to conquer Asia, which just goes to show don't be so sure what oracles say. But that's a great, what I'd like to call a fictional fantasy. That phenomenon of we solve the problem by totally avoiding all the complexity. Wouldn't it be great? This is a fantasy. Wouldn't it be great if we could solve all problems in the simplest possible way? So one of the examples that they give in this trope is of cutting the knot is this scene from Raiders of the Lost Ark. So they call him. It's practically his quote Indiana Jones's hat, quote unquote hat, slang meaning that's his signature move. Wow, wouldn't it be great? You know, somebody has practiced his whole life to be able to kill someone in a complicated way with a sword. But if you have a gun, you could solve that problem. And this became a whole theme. Ironically, it turns out that that was not in the original script of Raiders of the Lost Ark. Indiana Jones was supposed to duel this guy with his whip and show how the whip can match the sword, but as it turned out, Harrison
do it.
Yeah, you still need. It's still kind of a fantasy, but Harrison Ford made the mistake of eating some local food when they were shooting on scene in Egypt, and he came down with dysentery, so he couldn't film for more than a few minutes at a time. So he proposed to Steven Spielberg, "How about if I just shoot him?" And the rest is history. Meaning, I understand why they did it that way, but the fact that this is like the most memorable part of the movie, or maybe of action movies, it's up there. Action movies in general is like, that's an amazing fantasy. All you need is a gun, and Indiana Jones doesn't even stop to look if he shot him accurately. He doesn't even stop to see if the guy's still alive. No, he's already turning away. La la la. I've got better things to do. He's not nonchalant. Wow, that's an impressive fantasy. And this is not exactly in the same category, but since we're talking about different aspects of culture, some people still have these Rubik's Cubes. In fact, you could still buy a new Rubik's Cube. Well, this one is slightly used, but as they point out here on the TV Tropes website, whoever was the first player of Rubik's Cube who figured out how to pull it apart physically and rearrange the colors so it's solved, quote unquote, that's the equivalent of cutting the Gordian knot of the Rubik's Cube. Or theoretically, you could peel up all the stickers and put them all back, and then you put them all back so that they are properly rearranged. But that's not the way you're supposed to do the puzzle. It's not challenging that way, but that's I can't solve the problem, therefore I will bypass it. Wouldn't it be great if I could solve all my problems this way? So that's just one example of a page of TV Tropes. Most of their examples of the instant stuff, instant gratification, are on their page, the source number 2, Instant Expert. I mentioned just a few examples. They have many, many examples. The Matrix. Oh, yeah, we had a whole class about that. One of the aspects that we skipped when we discussed the Matrix was that because you're living in a virtual reality, so you can get a full training regimen for anything from martial arts to piloting written directly into your brain in a matter of seconds. Famous, very brief scene where Neo, is played by Keanu Reeves, he's like jerks his head and says, "I know Kung Fu." Wow, wouldn't that be great? That's an amazing fantasy. Apparently, in the Star Wars universe, there's a bunch of people who can do things like that, who can instantly master stuff. The Madison the Mermaid in the movie Splash, she comes to the city of people, and she can learn English in a single afternoon simply by watching television. Granted, she is a mermaid with magical powers, but this does seem a bit of a hand wave. That's TV Trope slang of like we'll just explain it with some sort of magical thing. Yeah, like waving your hand, like don't look behind the curtain. Like don't pay any attention to that. That's basically the lazy way to write to write fiction. Like, yeah, it's not important. Let's just move on. Then there's Troy and Gabriella, the two main characters, main love interests in the High School Musical series. Despite neither one being a trained singer, they manage harmony and perfect pitch with the song playing on a karaoke machine. Well, that's pretty impressive. That's in the first movie. And near the end of High School Musical 2, Troy is told to learn a new song literally 2 minutes before going on. And then when he says, I can't learn a new song, but somehow when he gets on stage 2 minutes later, he's not only learned the new song, but he has learned how to harmonize with his partner whom he has never sung that song with. Okay, that's not doable in real life, but that's okay. This is not real life. This is one of the more obvious fantasy elements of High School Musical. And then when you're dealing with the fantasy genre, as in science fiction fantasy, which includes, as we've discussed, a little comic books. So in the Marvel Cinematic Universe, well, there's Iron Man. Aside from everything else, his superpower is pretty much being a genius at everything, also having a lot of money. But what they emphasize is that there's no problem in any field that he can't master in short order. So one of the scenes of dialogue from the Avengers: when did you become an expert in thermonuclear astrophysics? And he answers, last night. And he's being serious. Like, that's amazing. It turns out that before the Marvel Cinematic Universe, there were other movies that did that. It seems that, I don't remember this. I haven't watched the James Bond movies in a long time, but apparently during the Roger Moore era, they had that sort of thing where James Bond can just pick up anything. And I'm going to skip the example from Twilight, where Bella becomes the best vampire ever, much better than the people who've been vampires for centuries. But that's okay because she's the main character, so she can do that. These are I like to call these fictional fantasies. It turns out that in the Jewish world, more specifically the Orthodox world, there are parallel fantasies. Let's call them Frum Fantasies. We'll just look at a couple examples of these described in different texts. The examples we're going to talk about are in learning Torah, in doing tshuva, and in doing kiruv. So, Rabbi Emmanuel Feldman. Rabbi Feldman he's retired now, but he used to be the editor of Tradition. He was the rabbi of Congregation Beth Jacob of Atlanta for almost 40 years. And he wrote in one of his pieces in Tradition that it's not the barriers to knowing the Talmud, it's not just technical ones of, how long does it take to learn the language and the styles and the formulas. He says, no. The concepts behind the Gemara of discipline, concentration, sacrifice, and toil, these are untranslatable in a society which demands that the most complex matters be mastered in 6 easy lessons, and that the profoundest ideas be reduced to the 10-second soundbite. And then he quotes this old story from the great rabbi complained, every Jew would like to become a Talmud scholar, a Talmud Chacham overnight, but during that night he would also like to get a good night's sleep, which is... it's a good line. I don't know if any rabbi ever said that, but it brings out the point. Okay, you can't become a Talmud Chacham overnight. It's not going to take a night or even a year. And sometimes people who come to yeshiva to learn how to learn Gemara end up being very disappointed because, like, I've been here for a whole year. Okay, 8 months. And I still can't make a laning. I still can't open up any Gemara. Right, but who said that it's the kind of skill that you can just master? It's great if you learn Torah for several hours a day, but you know what? Certainly most people who come to the one-year programs in Israel after high school, and even the ones who come to the places where you can learn Gemara all day, most people in those programs still cannot get to that level in 1 year. Just speaking personally, I would say it probably took me about 5 years of learning Gemara most of the day to be able to get to that point. Maybe someone who's really good can do it in less. I was never especially good at Gemara, but the point is that it's not the sort of thing that you can. It's not like with the video game. Okay, now you get to the next level, and now it doesn't work that way. Anyway, that's one example of a Frum fantasy of instant gratification. Wouldn't that be great if you could just say, "Ooh, now I know Gemara"? Source number 4, Rav Yitzchak Shurin is the Rosh Midrasha of Midrashet Rachel Valea. That's the women's division of Chappelle's. They are a learning institution that caters to Balo Tshuva. And he wrote an article back in 1994. I'm glad I saved it at the time because it's not on the internet, called A Healthy Approach to Tshuva. Tshuva at one time was understood to be a lengthy process which followed a number of concrete and specific steps. And that, Rabbeinu Yonah, the Rambam, here are the steps to Tshuva. In today's modern world, we expect instant gratification. Just as information and fast foods are ready at the touch of our fingers, we expect instant Tshuva, microwave Judaism. Like, put in the microwave, okay, that's it, now you're done. But, he says, really, slow growth applies to any change a person wants to make. If you read a tzaddik in our time, no matter how inspired you may be, you can't become a tzaddik in no time. I thought that was a good line. And even though I didn't put on the source sheet, there was a booklet that was circulating around Yerushalayim in the early 90s called "How to Get Deeper into Torah Without Going Off the Deep End." A tutor's suggestions for maintaining your sanity while studying in a Baal Tshuva yeshiva. You can find this online. I just wanted to mention just 2 lines from it. It's very good advice for people who, I'm going to be a Baal Tshuva. I'm going to go to a Baal Tshuva yeshiva, and I'm going to turn my life around. Just 2 lines. Forget about being a Rav or spiritual advisor for at least 5 years. Forget about becoming a saint, a tzaddik, or an angel for at least 10 years. And then it goes on to say, don't expect frum people to be angels either. It's a lot of wisdom in this booklet. We just mentioned learning Torah. We mentioned tshuva, and now there's kiruv. Okay, so Rav Shlomo Aviner, who is one of the more prolific rabbis here in Israel in the Chardal, Haredi Leumi community, the Rabbi Beit El, etc., etc. He wrote a series of articles a number of years ago about how to do kiruv. Just one paragraph in which he says, I'm going to translate freely. He says the first fundamental of doing kiruv is savlanut, is patience. Great Hebrew here. Ein patentim, ein trickium. Okay, there's no clever, there's no like clever trick. Trickium, that's modern Hebrew. Ein tachbulot, there's no. They translate that as strategy, but there's nothing clever you could do to make people do tshuva. It doesn't work that way. There's no specific thing. There's no amazing sentence that you could do. If you just say that will get people to do tshuva. And he says, you know what? Our prophets, the Nevi'im in Tanakh, they didn't know any wonderful and any amazing sentence either. After all, how could it be that 852 years went by of failure after failure of the Nevi'im to get people to listen to them until eventually there was the Korban? So clearly there isn't a great formula that if you just find it, you know what? People are much greater than we are, did not have such a formula either. And he says, P.S., great rabbis through the years didn't have such a formula either. We don't find any time in Jewish history that, well, Rabbi so-and-so was able to bring the masses back to God. Yeah, there are successes. There are people who become Bali Tshuva, and along the same lines, there are people who move away from observance, what they call in Israel, chozer b'she'elah, which there's a lot to say about that. But Rav Aviner is like, there isn't something out there that if you could just do this, that will magically, right, that's the point. That'll be magic. Okay, it's a frum fantasy. It doesn't work that way. Rabbi Feldman, same one we quoted before, said this about himself when he was getting started. One of my chaver, one of my friends from yeshiva days, said to me as I was leaving for Atlanta, turn that town upside down in 6 months. I want you to change their lives. I felt in my heart of hearts that 6 months was more than sufficient time to revolutionize things. Because he was going to a community that was nominally Orthodox, but they were not so observant. In 6 weeks, I realized it would take more than 6 months. In 6 months, I realized there would be no revolutions at all. It took over 10 years, he says, before tentative blossoms began to emerge, and decades more before anyone tasted real fruit. Rabbi Feldman's son, Rabbi Ilan Feldman, is the current rabbi of the same shul, and I assume he has all the problems that every synagogue rabbi has, but it's a lot easier for him after 40 years of his father preparing the ground for him. Anyway, I just thought that was an interesting example of one more like Frum fantasy, if you want to call it that. Let's briefly go back to the first page and look at the second Calvin and Hobbes here as another fantasy. Calvin says, everything is so darn hard. I wish I could just take a pill to be perfect. And I wish I could just push a button to have anything I want. Hobbes says, the American dream lives on. Calvin says, why should I have to work for everything? It's like saying I don't deserve it. So this is, one of many examples of a very pithy, very brief, getting to the point of the problem. Let's talk briefly about examples in Jewish history about how people failed because they were impatient. W.H. Auden was not Jewish, but he came up with an idea that it turns out is in Chazal. He says, source number 7, perhaps there's only one cardinal sin, impatience. Because of impatience, we were driven out of paradise, and because of impatience, we cannot return. If you've heard this idea before, it's because it's in Breshit Rabba. Chazal said this in opinion source number 8, that Adam Harishon, the original Adam, you know what? You couldn't even stand up. You couldn't even follow a command. You only had one command, and you couldn't even follow it for 1 hour. And yet your children, your descendants who, some of them anyway, became the Jewish people, we wait 3 years between planting a tree and being able to eat it because of the laws of Orla. Basically saying, like, the significance of following the law of Orla is it teaches us patience. But I just thought it was interesting because the emphasis of this Midrash is presumably about Orla, but it also agrees with the poet Auden, which is maybe the real problem with Adam and Chava was not so much the specifics with the tree and the knowledge, but that they just couldn't wait. And there other Torah sources that elaborate on this idea. If only they waited a little bit longer, then they would have been allowed to eat the tree of knowledge of good and evil. Anyway, just want to mention briefly, that's one example, Adam Harishon, classmate of mine at Yeshiva University who now lives in Beit Shemesh and teaches at YTA, Rabbi Mark Smilowitz. He wrote an article years ago when he was teaching at TABC in Bergen County, article called The Trouble with Aesop, in which he suggests that, and he's not the only one to say this, but he pulls together a few things, that part of Aesop's problem was that he couldn't wait. Give me the red stuff and give it to me now. Oh, you want my birthright? I'm not getting my birthright for years and years from now, but I'm hungry now. So, many people ask, Rabbi Smilowitz says, why did God have to choose one son over the other? Couldn't both Aesop and Yaakov be counted together as the inheritors of the divine covenant? After all, Yaakov's 12 sons all got the covenant together. It seems that by his own choice of lifestyle, Aesop excluded himself from the covenant. That the Torah requires mastery if it's to be handed down intact from generation to generation. Yaakov is accustomed to delayed gratification, even just on the simple pshat level, because he waited. Either you say that on the midrashic level he studied, he was in the tent, he was learning Torah, or on the pshat level he was a shepherd. He tended to his flocks, performing chores now for benefits later. That was the midah, the character trait of Yaakov, which made him, at least according to Rabbi Smolowitz, trying to connect the dots together, worthy of being able to get the covenant. He used the word nowism, which appears in the last source on the source sheet. I'm not sure we'll get to it. Moving a little bit later in Jewish history, according to source number 10, the Midrash in Shemot Rabba, part of the sin of the golden calf, which we're going to read not that long from now, right, a couple of weeks from now, that because they couldn't wait for Moshe Rabbeinu to come down from the mountain, if only they had waited a little bit more, then they wouldn't have sinned with the ego. It wasn't just that, they sinned. It was a terrible thing. Right, but there are lasting consequences. According to two opinions in this Midrash, as a result of the sin of the golden calf, the Malach HaMavet, the angel of death, was given power over them, meaning theoretically they were supposed to get the Torah and become immortal. We'll talk about immortality 3 weeks from now. Or alternatively, if only they had waited and received the Torah, there would never have been galut. There would never have been exile at all. Wow, that's really heavy. And the Midrash concludes that it was as if Hashem said, you guys, you're following Adam Harishon. Adam Harishon couldn't wait until a few hours to be able, this is one of the sources that says if only Adam had waited, he would have been allowed to eat from the tree. So the sin of the golden calf was not only idolatry, which it was, but it was also going back to the original sin from the Garden of Eden. And the one who elaborates on this is Rabbanit Rivka Shimon, who is, she gives marriage seminars. She's involved in women's groups going on Har HaBayit. And she used to have a column in the Parsha sheet, Shabbat B'Shabbatot. And she once wrote about this topic. And she says, part of maturity, part of adulting, becoming an adult, acting like an adult, what does it mean to be mature? That you can push off gratification. In contrast, the Jews in the desert, they were like a little baby. They were like a little kid where the kid can't wait for anything. So, they don't have water? Wow. We have no water. We're going to die. Oh, there's no, this is like a summary of basically Shemot through Bamidbar. Oh, there's no meat? Oh, terrible. Worst thing ever. Let's go back to Egypt. She says it's like saying, let's go back to the womb. Okay? Like, I don't want this hardship here. She says, worshiping the golden calf, it was worshiping childishness, worshiping the lack of responsibility. And that was so she says basically what led to the golden calf was idolatry, but what led to it was this being impatient. But what leads to impatience? Being a baby, not being able to have any responsibility. A couple more examples before we move away from the Chumash. Each of these, by the way, you can have a whole shiur on, and I've heard or read entire shiurim on each of these. Nadav and Avihu, they get zapped. They did something wrong. What exactly did they do wrong? There are at least a dozen opinions just in the Midrashim. One of the opinions is that they were walking behind Moshe and Aaron and saying, when are these two old guys going to die so we can take over? In other words, according to this opinion, what was the real problem? Because they were disrespectful? No, the real problem was, as a result of this, they then jumped ahead and brought fire that they weren't commanded because they decided they're taking over. They couldn't wait. Aha. So according to this opinion as well, what led to the sin of Nadav and Avihu was impatience. Rabbi Yossi Levine, the rabbi of the Jewish Center in Manhattan, he gave a sermon about this a couple of years ago on Parshat Shlach, and he talked about the Mapilim. After God says to Moshe, all right, that's it. The Meraglim, the Jews, they failed. You're not going in. You're going to wander here in the Midbar for 40 years. So the Mapilim are the Jews who say, no, we're going in. We're going to go right now. We're going to solve that problem. We're going to correct our mistake. Okay? So, and then they get killed because Hashem is not with them. But what led them to do that? So Rabbi Levine suggests, if they would be willing to wait for 40 years, they would have gone into the land. But they just couldn't bear the thought of having to wait so long. And he says, we've seen this play before, as they say in Israel. Hayinu bel Toseret, we were in that movie already. It's Chava, Adam and Chava in the Garden of Eden. It's Aesop returning from the field, and it's the story of the Mapilim. So he connects the dots here. Jumping ahead in Jewish history, one of the most famous stories in the Gemara, source number 14, where a non-Jew comes to Shammai and says, convert me to Judaism on condition that you teach me the whole Torah while I stand on one foot. So Shammai kicks him out, and Shammai is right. And Hillel then says, oh, okay, well, don't do to other people what you don't want done to them. That's the whole Torah. All the rest of the commentary, now go and learn it. Meaning, Hillel tricked the guy into converting to Judaism, and now that he's Jewish, Now you can't get away with just learning Torah while standing on one foot. Now that's all on condition that you now learn the rest of the Torah. There is no shortcut. This guy wanted a shortcut. And Shammai, following the letter of the law, is like, get out of here. Like, hey, we don't want you if you are now, if you can are only willing to go with the shortcut. And Hillel's like, Hillel tricks him, goes along with it, pretends that there's a shortcut, and then says, P.S., not really. There isn't any shortcut. Rabbi Avi Weiss has, who is retired now, but for many years he was the main rabbi of Hebrew Institute of Riverdale, also the founder of WebYeshiva.org and Yeshivat Maharat. It's a fascinating article in the forward, and it was reprinted in his book Principles of Spiritual Activism, which he talked about false messiahs. And he suggested that, this was written in 2001, referring to what was then the right wing and left wing in Israeli politics. A lot of this has changed since then. He argued that both extremes were messianic in the sense that, like, messianic in the sense lowercase m, not messianic like, oh, Mashiach is here already. Let's stop working. We don't have to follow any regular laws because Mashiach is here already. Like that's messianism in a very problematic way. False Messiah. He says he's the Messiah, Mashiach. So let's everything is different now. He says they're both messianic, both the right wing, like we Jews own the entire land of Israel, and there's nothing to compromise about. There can never be anything to compromise about because we're in messianic times. That's a literal messianic times. He says that's Gush Emunim, that was the Setar movement. And the opposite extreme was peace now, Shalom Achshav, saying, well, the main thing is just to give the Palestinians as much as possible, and then everything will be fine. We'll have the new Middle East. And Rabbi Weiss says that both of these are false messiahs in the sense that they're both not actually living in the real world. It's a little controversial, but I just thought it was interesting that Rabbi Weiss said. In contrast, one more example from a Jewish source, he says the rabbis in the Talmud Yerushalmi they compare the Messianic era to the rising of the sun. It happens gradually, kima kima. There's a book about religious Zionism by Rav Druckman called Kima Kima. Like that's our slogan, that the Geula, redemption, happens slowly. Don't give up on redemption just because the state of Israel isn't a Torah state already. Don't say, well, Mashiach hasn't come yet, so he's never going to come. You know what? We're in the middle of a process, and you have to be patient. So I just thought that was interesting that Rabbi Weiss tied that in to that part of the idea of Mashiach, that every day I wait. Every day, and I don't give up hope. And eventually Mashiach will come, but in the meantime, I don't give up hope just because I lose patience. Anyway, moving on to, that's a very brief view of, overview of impatience in Jewish history. Impatience today, meaning today's world, today's society. How did we get here? Fascinating line that quoted by James Gleick, in his book Faster, which I recommend, Faster, the Acceleration of Just About Everything. Quote from this professor, Stephen Kern, that the historical record shows that humans have never, ever opted for slower. In other words, the fact that people today want fast stuff, it's not that we're any worse than previous generations. We just have more ability to do stuff faster. So it's not like previous generations, they would never have done the things that we do. But nevertheless, a bunch of things have changed. Just a couple of quotes. There's so much to say on this. Paul. One second. Just go back briefly to Calvin and Hobbes. The first Calvin here from his father. It used to be that if a client wanted something done in a week, it was considered a rush job, and he'd be lucky to get it. And now with modems, faxes, and car phones, yes, this was from 1995, now everybody wants everything instantly. Improved technology just increases expectations. These machines don't make life easier, they make life more harassed. And in the background, Calvin says, 6 minutes to microwave this? Who's got that kind of time? And Calvin's dad concludes, if we wanted more leisure, we would invent machines that do things less efficiently. And that's in a nutshell. That's one of the main points in James Gleick's book. But fascinating line that I found in the middle of an essay by Walter Benjamin, essay from 1936, but quoting Paul Valéry, who wrote this in 1927 in French. It's almost as if the decline of the idea of eternity coincided with the increasing aversion to sustained effort. In other words, as we've entered the modern world and secularism has taken over and people globally in so many countries have given up on God, religion, hope in eternal reward and punishment, it's like, wow, that's so interesting. That goes together with the increasing aversion to sustained effort. Like, what's the point? I don't want to have to work hard now for something later. It's much easier to just start believing that there isn't going to be anything later. And yes, once more, Calvin says this as well. This is our third and last Calvin and Hobbes cartoon. Throwing these snowballs would give me immediate and certain pleasure. Refraining from throwing these snowballs in the hope of being rewarded at Christmas is delayed and uncertain pleasure. As usual, goodness hardly puts up a fight. In other words, your Yetzer Hara says, I want it now. It's hard. It's hard to convince yourself that, but if I just wait long enough, then I'll get Olam Haba. Yeah, but how long is that from now? That's decades from now. Forget it. But I want this now. So
it's literally your entire life from now.
It's what?
It's quite literally your entire life from now.
Quite literally your entire life from now. Right. So getting back to what, thank you, Yoni. Getting back to what we started to say before about the technology, Bill Bryson, in a book that I recommend, it's the American edition is called "I'm a Stranger Here Myself." The British edition is called "Notes from a Big Country." It's great. He grew up in America, moved to England, after living there for a while, moved back to America, and started writing columns for a British newspaper about what life is like in this crazy America. It's very insightful. Okay, also funny. Just one paragraph, source number 18. Americans, he's explaining this to Brits. Americans have always had a strange devotion to the idea of assisted ease. It's an interesting fact that nearly all the everyday inventions that take the struggle out of life, escalators, automatic doors, elevators, refrigerators, washing machines, frozen food, fast food, microwaves, fax machines, PS, smartphones, well, they didn't exist in the 1990s, were invented here in America, or at least first widely embraced here. Americans grew so used to a steady stream of labor-saving advances, by the 1960s, they had come to expect machines to do pretty much everything for them. So it's not that Americans are so much worse than previous generations, that previous generations didn't have the ability to do stuff this fast, but once you have the ability to do stuff this fast, then why would you settle for anything slow? And then you start getting impatient when things are slower. Before we go to continue with contemporary culture, fascinating theory. I don't remember where I first saw this quoted, but in the book, The Cultural Contradictions of Capitalism, where Daniel Bell speaks about there used to be Puritan, in the Western world, Puritan restraint and the Protestant ethic. What was the Protestant ethic? The work ethic. You work really hard. You work because of an obligation to your calling or to fulfill the covenants of your community. The Protestant ethic was undermined not by modernism, like secularism, which is what you would have thought. Oh, people became less religious, so therefore they didn't think there was any point in working long term. He's not even talking about Olam Haba. He's talking about Olam Hazeh. What's the point in working? The Protestant ethic was undermined by capitalism itself. The invention of the installment plan or instant credit. We're talking about basically starting at the very, very beginning in the 1940s and then taking off in the 1950s and 60s. It seems bizarre to those of us who were born after that, but you know what? It used to be that you couldn't just take a card out of your pocket and go like that and buy whatever you wanted. Even if you didn't have money in your bank account, you actually had to pay for it. And if you didn't have the money, you couldn't pay for it. This only got off the ground starting in the 1960s. So this guy who's basically one of the experts in the history of capitalism says, previously, you had to save in order to buy. But with credit cards, you could indulge in instant gratification. when the Protestant ethic was sundered, was separated from bourgeois society, only the hedonism remained. And the capitalist system lost its transcendental ethic. Meaning there is still capitalism, and there are still people who work hard, but the idea that there's like an ethic, there's something like transcendental, there's a value in working, at least in the Western world, Christian world, not anymore. And he says, it's not because of secularism, it's because of credit cards. I just thought that was an interesting idea, even if he's exaggerating still. It brings out it's something that's worth thinking about. And then this essay, which we're not going to have time to go through, but worth going through a bunch of examples by Christopher Muther in source number 20. Impatience may be most pronounced among the young, wired nearly from birth. Okay, as in, if there's an app for everything, if you can hold everything on your phone, why would you want to do things the slow, painstaking way? And to some extent, that's an excellent argument, depending on what you're talking about. Okay, if you get used to same-day delivery, which Walmart did not quite get off the ground, you can get it 2 days. Then if you could get something in 2 days, why would you want to wait for it to take a week or two to be shipped to you? And we're not going to have time to go through this, but Amazon Prime has all sorts of actually, maybe we will briefly. Amazon Prime has all sorts of things that you can, if you're willing to, if you're willing to pay, you can get sometimes even free one-day delivery, free same-day delivery. Sometimes if you're ordering groceries through Amazon Prime, you could get, depending on where you live in America, free 2-hour grocery delivery. Why would you want to order through some supermarket that makes you wait until tomorrow to get your groceries? Okay, you can add items through the week. You can get Key by Amazon, in which they will bring you stuff either to your home or leave it in your garage, okay? And you know what? You might have to pay for something like this. Well, you do have to pay for Amazon Prime, but once you get used to getting stuff 2 days later, well, then of course you're going to pay. Right now it's $13 a month in America to get Amazon Prime. Like, how could you not do that? And that brings us very briefly to Disney World. You can get this. Disneyland has a thing called Max Pass that costs you $20 per person per day on top of the regular ticket price. They'll let you get into a bunch of rides, skipping all the lines, but even that has restrictions. This is an article from the website Trip Savvy. How to skip all the lines at Disney World. Subtitle: it can be done, but it'll cost you. And the short of it is, you pay for Disney World's VIP tour services, which as of this past year, that's $349 per person for 7 hours, not including the $100 whatever dollars for the theme park admission. But wow, wouldn't it be great to be able, especially if you're going during prime time, during tourist season, wouldn't it be great to be able to skip all those lines? Well, it'll cost you. But if you have the money, why would you not? Why would you not want to spend that money on skipping the line and grinning gleefully at everybody as you walk past all the people who will have to wait online like everybody else? We are running out of time, so I'm going to skip now to the section called "What's Wrong with Impatience Anyway?" So one point, which is made by Tommy Tomlinson, I mentioned this before, it's a moving memoir. The premise of this memoir is, as this journalist, he was about to turn 50, he reevaluated himself. He weighed 460 pounds, and it was in some ways ruining his life. It was causing him major health problems. He decided he had to change his life, and he wrote about his year of doing not just a diet, but trying to think about how he got to this terrible place in his life and how to get away from it. And it's a book with hope, but it's also very, let's just say it doesn't give any magical solution. So that's his book, The Elephant in the Room. And he has this line that he quotes from somebody who worked with him on the Charlotte Observer. The surest sign of an adult is the ability to accept delayed gratification, which is exactly what Rivka Shimon said a couple of pages ago about the ego. He said, to control my weight, to become the person I'm supposed to be, I have to shake the habits that have clung to me since I was a kid. I'm skipping a little bit. I don't want to put away the child inside me, but I can't let him run the house either. And that's what he's been doing my whole life. And he says he and his wife have started using the word adulting, which is a contemporary word. I'm not sure if the dictionaries have it yet, but people use it in a serious way, like meaning if you don't want to act, you don't want to be responsible. Well, guess what? You're already an adult. You might as well adult things. You might as well act like an adult. Even things like we wash the dishes right away instead of waiting. We file away papers instead of letting them pile up in a stack. We're adulting. And so, too, adulting is the only way I can beat my addiction to food. I thought it was interesting that was the way that he applies that insight into trying to solve his weight problem. Obviously, we're going to skip the next source. I'll just very, very briefly mention it. It's Stephen Covey in his book, First Things First. He has a chapter about the law of the farm. He contrasts cramming in school. Cramming in school is when you goof off and then you spend all night before the big test trying to cram the semester's worth into your head. Okay? Can you imagine cramming on a farm? Oh, yeah, I forgot to plant in the spring. I didn't buy, flaking out all summer. And then in the fall, now I'm really going to get the harvest. No, actually. Cramming does not work in a natural system like a farm. That's the fundamental difference between a social system and a natural system. And he goes on to say, in the long run, the law of the farm, meaning you're not going to get a good harvest unless you put in a lot of work. Long term, in the long run, the law of the farm governs in all areas of life. The long run. And then he goes through a bunch of examples: character, physical health, marriage. Whoops, I meant to skip the next page. Marriage, relationships with your spouse, relationships with your children. In long term, the law of the farm governs in all areas of life. And then he applies it to health, which is what Tommy Tomlinson was doing as well. Economic well-being, that's what we said with the credit cards. Yeah, we can live with the rescue fantasy of winning the lottery, okay? And somebody or something out there is going to magically solve all our problems and absolve us of the need to develop competence in financial affairs. Right. That's back in the category of the fantasy, meaning the fantasy of instant gratification that is not going to work long-term in life. So you might as well accept it now, and that's more or less what he tries to argue. Social needs, mental needs, spiritual needs. He has a whole chapter on this on this phenomenon, and he concludes. Stephen Covey concludes on page 8. There is no way quality of life can grow out of illusion. The quick fixes, platitudes, and personality ethic techniques that violate basic principles will never bring quality of life results. And a couple other sources about health. Right. We only have a couple minutes left, so I want to conclude with two sources. One is from source number 25, Dr. Micah Goodman. He's the head of the pluralistic Beit Midrash in Ein Prat. He has written several books written in Hebrew. Most of them are being translated into English, and they are important. One is called Maimonides and the Book That Changed Judaism, Secrets of the Guide for the Perplexed. He has one called Catch 67, The Left, the Right, and the Legacy of the Six-Day War. His most recent book is called The Wandering Jew, with an O. The Wandering Jew, Israel and the Search for Jewish Identity. Anyway, he has a lot of insights. So he wrote Dvar Torah a number of years ago, in which he says the primary characteristic of of Jewish history is hamtana, is waiting, internalizing the possibility according to which the promises that we have from Hashem and the Nevi'im, these ancient promises will be fulfilled only gradually. It's worth holding out. Don't go for fill in the blank, the converting to Christianity or Islam or becoming secular and communist, whatever reason people have left traditional Judaism over the centuries. To stay Jewish, to stay traditional is to say, I don't need everything to depend on Mashiach coming today. Mashiach will come eventually. Olam haba and reward and punishment after this life will come eventually. I don't need it right now. For the time being, I'm willing to stick it out. So Dr. Micah Goodman argues that midah of patience lies behind the continued existence through Jewish history of Judaism, Jews and Judaism. And I'll just conclude before I wrap it up. Rabbi Dal Marmor, he is Rabbi Emeritus at the Holy Blossom Temple of Toronto, largest Reformed congregation in Canada. He was born he was born quite a while ago. He was born in Poland, so I assume his name should be pronounced Dove. Anyway, this article, which I was given in Shalvim in 1989, was the first item in my file on instant gratification. See, I've been collecting the material for 30 years. And the article is called, I assume it was a sermon, called Nowism. The consumerist dogma, buy now and pay later, like we said with credit cards, is based on a philosophy of life that can be formulated as live now, pay later. And that's diametrically opposed to our religion. We say pay now, live later. Judaism is a system of delayed gratification. And if life is too short to sort everything out, so we'll wait for the life of eternity that's promised beyond the grave when everything will be sorted out. The notion of a life after death is inherent in the system of delayed gratification, which is more or less what we quoted Paul Valery as saying back in source number 17. Nowists reject every notion of a beyond. It's all here and now anyway, so there can't be Olam Haba. But as Jews, however, and it's interesting, this is even a Reform rabbi saying this, we can't make sense of life without such a notion. The things worth having are worth waiting for, even beyond death. Fascinating idea. That is our time is up. Thanks to everybody for joining me. And I will end the recording shortly, and then I'll go through the comments and wait around if anybody wants to say anything. But I'll just invite everybody to join me next week. For the topic of confronting fear, the different approaches to dealing with fear, horror, divergent, and defending your life. So I'm going to end the recording now, and then we'll continue with the comments.